would match 3 years in a row the kind of growth that we've seen in imports and in demand. But let's see, it seems perhaps it'll happen in the US, but not in Europe. We're seeing prices on kernels led lower, mostly by prompt shipments, mostly by July and August shipments, mostly by mid to smaller processors. And one of the difficulties here is you can certainly buy low-priced kernels, but can you buy them from someone you want to do business with? Can you buy them from a reliable partner for a forward position? Not many buyers leave themselves open for shipment 1 month or 2 months away. We're also seeing continued strong interest in African cashew kernels. The higher prices persist and there is good demand. We have to be careful not to exaggerate that. The market share of Vietnam remains huge, but it is a factor. It is really something that's coming. And of course, that's key to this question, is processing at a crossroads. Overall on demand, notable things I think are that Indian demand probably isn't as buoyant as we might have hoped for. That can change. The busy period in India is coming. It's not that far away now, and that could change demand. There are pretty good stocks of RCN in place for that, I think, but more will be needed. Chinese demand continues to be impacted by COVID restrictions, and various outbreaks of COVID in China from time to time. But really, we need to be careful how we read a lot of these reports in the market. We see a lot of the reports from brokers and others talking about the impact of inflation on cashew demand, on cashew prices. But let's remind ourselves that inflation means higher prices, not lower prices. Inflation does not necessarily mean, if we look at the history, inflation does not necessarily mean that demand for cashew kernels is negatively impacted. Indeed, if we look back through various periods of recession, and if we look at the big picture, we can see that cashew demand has risen every year since 1985, except for one, and that was 2008. And that was really a period from September to December in the financial crisis. So overstating the impact of inflation, which may disappear quickly, according to some analysts, or the impact of a potential recession could lead to mistakes in organizing the market and in supply, and particularly in pricing cashew kernels going forward. Let's have a quick look at the countries that are in a main harvest time at the moment in West Africa. Main features: early rains, now normal rains, logistical problems, and freight costs. These are the three big things. What we're seeing in Guinea-Bissau is continued estimates of a pretty good crop. Prices locally are steady. Demand remains quite strong. But these problems of infrastructure, they're nothing new. They're not going to go away anytime soon. But the problems of infrastructure, the port, transportation remain. They're complicating. They make prices higher. They make shipments slower. If we look in Senegal, still forecast of a good crop, although there's probably a lot more material in Senegal than is grown in Senegal, with, it looks like, pretty heavy cross-border trade this year, according to reports. Cargo is not moving yet, which is disappointing. Or if it's moving rather slowly. That puts the quality a little bit at risk, and it means that the delivery to market will be a little bit later. Could have an impact on prices as time goes on, as we're seeing in the Gambia, slower shipments, slower arrivals of the crop. Banjul port is never the easiest to deal with, and we're seeing a certain impact of that, I think, on prices. So generally across the region, it looks like the crops are pretty good. It looks like the usual problems of infrastructure are playing a part, and it looks like the cross-border trade is playing a major part this year. And of course, cross-border trade is related to regulation in the different countries, perhaps high taxation in the countries, but it's also related to the infrastructure and the ease of getting product to where it needs to be. and the ease of transportation, which is proving to be a bigger problem. So it seems to me that the harvest in this area, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and the Gambia, will have a pretty long tail on it this year as product becomes a little bit slower to move. And that could have impact further down the line as raw cashew nuts are needed for processing and export in Vietnam and for consumption in India. So not a very busy period in the market. I don't expect a particularly busy week this week or next, but I think we're coming to a point where we might see the market transition on kernels into a slightly different trend. So it gives us a good opportunity to have a look at some of the more basic questions, and we'll have a look at this question: has the Vietnamese sector become a paradox? What I'm really asking here, we could say, has the unstoppable force of Vietnamese processing development and market share met the immovable object of this complicated and malfunctioning international raw cashew nut supply chain? That's really the crux of the issue here. And if we look at the structure of the market, first of all in Vietnam, and we look at the number of units, the type of units, and the structure of the market. So there are, I'm told, a total of 3,000 units in Vietnam that might process, pack, most of them very small, most of them micro units. There are maybe 350 processors or processing units. Of those, about 250 are export suitable. And then we have an unknown number of, at least unknown to me, number of packing centers and export units that draw product in from further up the chain to convert it for export. So this issue is recognized in Vietnam, and that's why I'm putting this quote from the chair of Vietnamese, Mr. Nai Duc Chan. And I'll just read what he said. He said, quote, "It can be said that this huge pressure on the competition when deploying sales strategies and product strategies of each enterprise as well as the whole industry." So there's essentially saying that this structure, where so many units are competing with each other, and I want to remind you, they're competing with each other for supply of raw material as well as for sale of kernels, puts pressure on the whole industry. And he goes on to say, and this is probably the crux of the matter, and he's observed it very well, in my opinion, if these enterprises do not restructure, invest, and operate professionally and work their way up themselves, they will face many difficulties or may even be eliminated. So what we're talking about here, in a word, is a rationalization of the industry. And we have to ask the question, does this end, the 3,000 units, the subcontractors, the village processors, does this meet the needs of buyers? That's a fact. There are also questions, labor practices in this part of the industry. I'm not saying in the organized processors, I'm talking about subcontractors and small units. And we do know that in this part of the industry, there are big questions. If you read the Ethical Trading Initiative of Norway's report on the Vietnamese cashew sector, you get a flavor of that. If you read the Vietnamese Minister of Commerce report on child labor in the country from 2017, you also get a pretty good flavor of what can happen at this end of the chain and whether or not that's sustainable. But does it meet buyers' requirements? No, it doesn't, in many, many ways. Whereas the major processors do, this end of the chain doesn't, and that's the contradiction which the chair of Vietnamese is referring to. I don't think he's referring to labor issues. I think he's referring to the commercial aspects, but it's true of both. So we'll go back to the question we asked 2 weeks ago. Because I think this question, on reflection, when we ask the question regarding the processing crossroads, this is a really important question. So I thought we'd go back and have a look at this as we work our way toward an answer to the question. So let's remind ourselves that we have seen prices crashed, and I'm saying crashed because we're looking at 30 cents, 40 cents drop in prices in a very short period of time. Why would the dominant supplier do that? And we talked about misreading the impact of the pandemic, but we could also now add misreading the impact of the war in Ukraine, misreading the impact of the return of inflation. Same reaction. Competition or competitiveness based on price. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but if you compete solely on price, your reaction to a perceived drop in demand is to drop the price. Cash flow plays a huge impact, and the cash flow impact of a loss of sales to China, which are paid for quickly, which move all grades and happen in the early part of the year, has a huge impact. And that is influenced by the financing method for export. So if you're looking at collateralized inventory, in other words, your finances against contracts of sale, purchases of raw material, or stock in your warehouse, and you can raise varying amounts or percentages of the value according to which one it is, that's going to encourage you just to keep going, to make contracts, to collateralize your inventory. Then you add into that those financing mechanisms, they're trade finance mechanisms. So they're not continuous open credit lines. Trade finance mechanisms operate in windows. So it might be a 3-month window, it might be a 6-month window. But as you work your way through, you've got to do the same thing again. So this has a huge influence on the way the business works. And if you're talking about many small units, many mid-sized units that may not be as financially independent as the large units, you get this effect. We have to sell because we have to show we have sales. If that just happens to be the day that buyers aren't interested, we'll drop the price. If we look at other factors coming into this, so you're financing against losses over 3 years, partially due to the pandemic, partially due to the low price environment that your own sector has created, perhaps the competition between these units, perhaps this paradox. And you're doing that within a long fractured supply chain, so that the delivery time for your raw material, instead of being days, as it might be for the local crop, for the Cambodian crop, for a West African processor buying raw material for processing, it might be a week. But if that is 6, 8, 10 or more weeks, that then complicates the position further. Plus, the reliability of that supply is questionable at times too. Then we add into that the two big factors that have been there for so long: poor market analysis and information, and a misfiring effort to influence prices, and not forgetting that all of these factors influence each other. You get this situation where prices start to drop, which creates a situation of lack of parity with RCN, which creates lower performance, losses perhaps, or very low profits, which makes it difficult to finance, which makes it more important to have a contract of sale, which makes you have to drop the price, which makes you lose more money, and you get into this kind of vicious circle. And maybe that's where the Vietnamese cashew sector is right now. And I think the quote that we've seen illustrates that people are well aware of these kind of issues in Vietnam. What's actually happened in that time is that the kernels market, yes, it did hit the lowest prices for many years, but Vietnam's market share remained extremely high. Exports grew by 64%. So we do see a retracement of exports this year. Exports are a little bit lower than last year, but still the growth in the last 4 years has been incredible. Never seen before. Maybe it will never be seen again, but it's absolutely incredible level of growth. And it's interesting that when you run a system that continually demands improvement, continually demands higher turnover, higher growth, higher exports, higher export values, you're ultimately going to fail. It's not physically possible to do that year on year. And that can send the wrong message to people in the industry. If we look actually what did happen in markets, we see huge growth in Europe. We see huge growth in the US. The US market, which was growing at an average rate of about 1% for 5 years, in the last 3 years has grown by 17%. So what we've seen is remarkable growth. We've seen higher farm gate prices in West Africa. Much higher, in fact. We've seen a complete recovery from the decline after the 2017 price boom. But we've also seen much higher freight costs. So we've seen surging freight costs during the pandemic, but now we're seeing freight rates to Asia, as opposed to kernels coming from Asia, are rising on energy costs, as we know, and on capacity issues in a long hangover from the pandemic disruptions. So that's what's really happening. And it's at odds with the perception that we're seeing, or at least the behavior we're seeing from Vietnamese processors. So let's have a look then. Standing back for a moment, let's have a look at the cashew world as it stands at the end of 2021 and into 2022. So Vietnam's competitiveness is based on technology and scale, which allows lower cost. That allowed Vietnam to take a huge market share, as we said, 89% of the US market, 77% of the European market in 2021. But the contradiction is that Vietnam is, in 2021, was 82% dependent on imports. Now, a lot of those were from Cambodia, but most of it was still from distant origins. And if we look at VNCAS, if we look at generally the trade in Vietnam, their public statements, if we look at the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, we get statements that we want to protect